Good morning, everyone. Adrian Joyce here. I'm the Secretary General of EuroACE, and I'm delighted to invite you to our second mini workshop on the Renovation Wave, and delighted to welcome so many of you this early in the morning. I am going to, first of all, run through the guidance that we would like you to respect during the event as we are recording it for as a future resource. And that guidance I know you'll have heard many times in the last couple of weeks of various lockdowns. So first of all, you are kindly asked to remain muted, and that those who are on a telephone, if possible, and that way our sound track will be uninterrupted. Also, no cameras on for the duration of the webinar, as the cameras use up bandwidth and again affect the quality of the sound. So only speakers and me as the moderator will stay unmuted. The 25-minute question and answer session roughly will follow the presentation. And ahead of that session, we would like you to be asking questions through the GoToMeeting chat box, and we would like you to address those questions to everyone. Then during the question and answer session, I will choose the questions usually in order of their arrival in the chat box, but I may try to group them in order to assist the speaker in addressing topics. Of course, the questions should be as concise as possible, and if time allows, we will cover all questions, but if not, we will gather them together and in due course we will ask the speaker to respond to them. Of course, the PowerPoint presentation and the questions will be shared with you in due course, and the recording of the webinar will be put online for future use. So once again, for those who've joined during my short introduction, I kindly ask you to remain muted throughout the full session, just to give us the best chance of good quality sound on recording. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Julie Kestrup. She is the President of EuroACE, and she will now give an introduction to today's theme. Over to you, Julie.
Yes, good morning, everyone. So my name is Julie Kestrup, as Adrian just said, and I'm Head of Public Affairs at Danfoss and also the President of EuroACE. So I'd also like to extend my welcome to all of you and thank you for being with us today for the second webinar in our mini-series on the Renovation Wave. Just like with the first webinar, we've got a really diverse group on the call. We've got members, we've got partners, we've got people from the various institutions, from the Commission, from the Parliament and Perm Reps. And welcome to all of you, and I hope we have an equally good discussion to the first call. So today we'll talk about something that's really important. We'll talk about money. How do we finance energy efficient buildings and renovation? Less than a month ago, the Commission released the climate law, aiming at enshrining the EU's climate neutrality objective for 2050 into legislation. It feels like a different era, but it was actually less than a month ago. And to get there in the most cost efficient way to get to this climate neutrality objective, we should start where the potential is the biggest. And that means with energy efficiency, and it means with building stock. Because in the EU, the building and construction sectors combined are responsible for 50% of final energy consumption and nearly 50% of CO2 emissions. And at the same time, we know that 75% of the buildings that exist today will still be with us in 2050. And so that means that to reach our goals of climate neutrality by 2050, tackling the existing building stock through renovation is essential. But to reach these goals, we need substantial upfront investment, and we need that now in the years to come, because otherwise we won't be on track. And we often hear that this money is in fact available, but just needs to find its right owners. So how do we crack that code, especially now, where we're almost daily in a reality with even more strain on and competition for financial resources? That's what we'll talk about today. Elaine will talk us through some of the basics of financing energy efficiency in buildings. And she would also talk about some of the opportunities and the obstacles that we've observed so far. This is a topic that we at EuroACE have worked on for years. And of course, it won't be any less present in our work in the years to come. And then we will also look specifically at the opportunities of Renovation Wave and say, okay, for this initiative to take off and deliver what we'd like it to do, what then are the financial implications that we need to make sure are covered. And with that, over to you, Hélène.
Thank you, Julie, for the introduction, and good morning to all. It is my pleasure to speak to you today on behalf of EuroACE. Next slide, please. So EuroACE is the European Alliance of Companies for Energy Efficiency in Buildings. We are a Brussels-based business association, and we work with EU institutions to help the EU to move towards an efficient use of energy in buildings. We represent Europe's leading companies involved with the manufacture and distribution of energy-saving goods and services. Our members represent, they actually employ 200,000 employees in over 900 production facilities and office locations throughout the EU. But our specificity is actually that we have a cross-sector, cross-technology representation, which means that when we're advocating for energy efficiency in buildings and building renovation, we advocate for a holistic approach to that. Next slide, please. So, of course, we advocate for energy efficiency in buildings and building renovation because we believe that it's the most cost-effective method of creating jobs, alleviating energy poverty, providing people with comfortable and healthy homes, meeting carbon reduction targets, but also achieving energy security. Next. We also run the Renovate Europe campaign, which is a political communications campaign aiming at motivating EU and national institutions to take bold action in the field. We have 38 partners in the campaign, including 14 at national level, and we also enjoy a high political support with our champions Together for Renovation, which are members of the European Parliament, but also members of national parliament and city leaders. Next slide, please. In the framework of the Renovate Europe campaign, we also work on showcasing best practices, and we've done that, for example, last year with an exhibition in the European Parliament. All the exhibition is now available online at this link, which you can see on the slide. And we've also showcased some financing programs in there, so that's why I mention it here. Next. So today's discussion, as Julie was introducing, is about financing energy efficient buildings and renovation in the context of the upcoming Renovation Wave, which is an initiative which the Commission will propose at the end of September this year. And I will go through this topic in 3 points. The first one, just recording some basic information, then recalling what has been done so far, which are the funds existing, but also the limitations, and then proposing some ideas to go forward and how to include financing aspects in the Renovation Wave, and also seeking some of your input and suggestion on that. Next. So starting with the basics, I want to recall that when we talk about energy efficiency in buildings and building renovation, of course, we're talking about a high volume of investment needed. We know that at EU level, deep energy renovation of the building stock is estimated to be worth 300 billion euro a year between now and 2050 if we want to achieve climate neutrality. And we also know that the biggest needs are actually in this decade. So according to Commission estimates, an additional 260 billion euro per year are needed in the next decade, 2021 to 2030, if we want to achieve the 2030 targets. And among those 260 billion euro, the biggest part should go to residential building renovation. Next slide, please. This is clearly shown in this graph where you can see the investment needs in different sectors for the next decade. And clearly residential and tertiary buildings are the sector which need most investment. Next. So there is the question of a high volume of financing needed if we are talking about big renovation works. So beyond this limited amount of public financing, which is often mentioned as a barrier, there are other barriers specific to the sector. The first one being that the building sector is a fragmented market, and we need aggregation to reach a critical mass that would then make it interesting for financial institutions. There are some high upfront costs and long payback times. fact also that often financing is a one-step action, whereas renovations are usually done step by step. And then we have a lack of reliable data, and I think here about energy performance certificates and their limitations. But we need that good data is actually the basis for financial institutions and especially commercial banks. What I want to highlight here is that actually barriers linked to financing are not more important nor less important than any other barriers, and this has been found by the Commission in a study that was published end of last year, which looked at barriers but also incentives for energy renovation of buildings. And actually financing was not found to be more or less important than any other barriers. Next slide, please. So coming to actually what exists, what has been done so far, I want to draw your attention first to this report from the Joint Research Center, which has actually analyzed end of last year almost all financial and fiscal instruments existing across all member states for energy renovation. They've analyzed more than 120 programs and schemes actually, and found that it's actually mostly subsidies that member states are using to fund energy renovations, 61%, then loans, 19%, and also tax incentives with 10%. Overall, it's about 15 billion euros spent each year with public resources on renovation. The JRC also classified all the instruments analyzed by type, whether public or private, but also by member states. So it's really interesting if you're interested into a specific type of instrument, then you can find all the member states using it. If you are interested in more like a member state landscape of financing, you can also go through that lens. Last part, which is very interesting in that report, is that they identified good practices. And they use criteria such as the impact of the financing schemes, not only in terms of energy savings, but also, for example, the jobs created and other benefits. They also use criteria such as cost effectiveness, but also the scalability potential of those financing schemes. So I really advise you to have a look at this report, which is very rich and has a lot of good examples. Next. So when we look at what is existing, and I want to have here a focus on what is existing at EU level, because this is the level we are working on here at EuroACE. There are a lot of funds available for building renovation and energy efficiency in buildings. Of course, we have to start with the multi-annual financial framework. So this is the EU budget, and you have a lot of funds which can be used for that purpose. The first one, the most important one being, of course, the European Structural and Investment Funds. Those are actually, this is the official name of the regional and cohesion policy funds. But you have some other funds like Horizon Europe, which is about research and innovation, LIFE, which is about more the energy, climate and environment objectives, and then InvestEU, which is the new name of the Juncker plan, and which is more about infrastructure and big spending. And then, of course, we have the European Investment Bank, and here I also want to highlight that the bank has adopted end of last year a new energy lending policy, which is quite ambitious and has a focus on building renovation with a specific initiative. We know that the EIB has always been very strong on advisory services, notably with the ELENA facility, and this facility has been extended until 2023 with more than 97 million euro. What is interesting in this new energy lending policy of the EIB is that now they have agreed to finance up to 75% of eligible capital expenditure for projects linked to building renovation. So it is above the usual 50%, which has been done so far. Next. Another source of funding which comes from the EU level is the carbon revenue recycling. So it's actually using the revenues stemming from the EU ETS. And according to an analysis from RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project, we know that using those carbon revenues to invest in energy efficiency is actually saving 7 to 9 times more emissions than just by carbon pricing alone. And this is just not only like a theoretical idea, it's also already used in some member states. And one of the good examples here is from Czechia with the new green savings program, which has been used for several years now. And for example, since 2014, they've spent more than 440 million euro on building renovation projects. So I've talked about the MFF, the EIB, and the carbon revenue recycling, which are three big sources of EU funding for building renovation. But I want to highlight here that, again, according to this Commission study from last year, they have found that actually most of the renovations done in Europe over the last years are actually paid by own capital. And this is about 53 to 72%, depending on what kind of building we are looking at, whether commercial or residential. So those renovations are actually mostly paid by own resources of homeowners. Next. So I've talked about the EU funds available, but I also want to talk about what policy has done in terms of financing to tackle this challenge. An important step was in 2013 when the European Commission and UNEP FI created the EFIG, it's the Energy Efficiency Financial Institutions Group, which brings together financial institutions, banks, and energy efficiency stakeholders together to think about how to unlock financing for energy efficiency, not only in buildings, but this is a big part. And they've come up with some good recommendations, which then I have translated into policy. When we look at legislation, when the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive was revised in 2018, it looked as well at financing aspects. The first point being that the long-term renovation strategies, which were in the EED, were strengthened and brought in the EPPD, and they have financing aspects included there when the directive is actually requesting member states to look at how to aggregate projects, how to reduce perceived risk, how to better use public funding to leverage private investment, and to look at how to develop advisory tools. There's also a provision requiring member states to link their financial measures to the targeted or achieved energy savings. So there is clearly a link drawn between the volume of financing given to a project to the level of ambition in terms of energy savings. And also during the EPPD revision, the Smart Finance for Smart Buildings was created. So this is a facility with the EIB, and it's really a guarantee to help to further mobilize private investment. Next slide, please. So there has been some progress done, but there are still limitations which we can observe on the market. And I've listed a few of them here. The lack of absorptions of EU funds is actually quite worrying because we have a lot of money available, notably in the European Regional Development Fund and the Cohesion Fund, but it's still difficult to actually use all those funds for building renovation. Then there is the difficulty just because of the legal frameworks, sometimes at national level, to blend different funds together, notably to blend public and private funding. Aggregation, while we know this is very important, it's still difficult on the ground to reach set thresholds, which are sometimes very high. For access the ELENA facility, I think it's a threshold of 30, which is quite big. And then, of course, overall, the financing landscape will look difficult and complex. People who want to start the building renovation projects, because you have so many different funds and schemes, and then even though once you have chosen the scheme you want to apply for, the financing process is still sometimes difficult. Next. So coming now to the way forward and maybe ideas to include financing aspects in the renovation wave. I want to hear throughout some ideas and suggestions on how we can improve financing, access to financing in the renovation wave. And this is actually based on the different approaches that can be adopted for the renovation wave. Some of you might have followed the first webinar last week, where we explained that the renovation wave can be based on two approaches, one based on segments and one based on more an area or district level. Knowing that these two approaches are complementary and not exclusive. So I'm basing myself on these approaches. So the first one is the segment approach. So when we are looking at renovation based on building types, and here it would be clearly interesting in terms of financing to draw up matrix based on building types, so single-family homes, multi-family homes, commercial buildings, etc. But also looking at ownership structures and consumer preferences or characteristics. It's then giving a more granular picture of the building stock, but also of people living in those buildings, and would enable an easier aggregation of projects. Which means that in turn we need a variety of financing streams to be really adapted to the variety of buildings and also the variety of people. But here there would be a clear link in terms of policy to trigger points. Then when we look at an area-based approach for the renovation wave, this would clearly enable financing of smaller scale projects by creating a locally driven supply chain. There are also some activities linked to renovation, such as reskilling of workers, which can be funded by the Just Transition Fund. So for those who don't know, the Just Transition Fund has been proposed early this year by the European Commission in the framework of the regional policy, but to help specifically some regions that are most in need for the energy transition. And clearly this could be matched with an area-based approach of the renovation wave. And then finally, there are some projects which are looking at how to finance a building renovation not based on the owner, which is usually the case, you give a loan to an owner, but base the financing on the property. And here I think about a project called EuroACE, and this could be maybe extended to not only buildings, but an area for a renovation of an area. Next slide, please. And then if we look at both approaches, both a segment or area-based approach of the renovation wave, in any case, what we need is a better link between advisory services and financing. So advisory services, be it one-stop shops, renovation passports, work coordinators, so what we call in French maîtrise d'œuvre, all those need to be better linked with financing, and this is actually in two ways. The first one, those services, they need financing to get started, but also to get sustained. So this is at the moment, a lot of them are emerging, but after a few years, they need to be sustained. They need to find a good business model. And then reversely, those services also need to advise on financing. We know that this would actually facilitate the work of commercial banks if those advisory services take charge of not only advising people on the technicalities of their renovation, but also on where to get financing. And in any case, if we're talking about financing, we need stability of the support schemes that needs to last longer than a political term. And of course, continuous communication is very important. And for example, this has been really a good point in the Czech program, which runs thanks to the EU ETS revenues, because there are continuous calls for tenders. Next. And then if we're looking a bit broader than just the renovation wave, there are other actually hooks and places where we can plug enabling financing conditions for renovation. Just coming back to the EIB, which has a specific initiative on building renovation. So we think, of course, that this should be matched with the Renovation Wave. We know that the Commission intends to propose open platforms for renovation. We don't know exactly what they have in mind, but of course these open platforms should be at a local, regional, or national level. In any case, they should liaise with the IB to get tailored advice and get financing that matches the local or regional needs. In the MFF, I've talked about the Just Transition Fund, but I also want to draw attention to the preparation of partnership agreements that are actually discussed right now at national level, and operational programs prepared at regional level. So this is actually happening at the same time. The multi-annual financial framework is still discussed at EU level, and it's not concluded yet, but at the same time, member states and regions are asked to prepare kind of their spending strategies of those funds. So this is where building renovation should be mentioned. And then there is work done at EU level with the Sustainable Europe Investment Plan to help actually direct whether public or private money towards sustainable investments, thanks to the EU taxonomy, the revision of the state aid rules, but also the Energy Taxation Directive. So there are several ways to improve the financial framework that could be in turn beneficial for building renovation. Next. And then to conclude, I just want to finish by saying that financing is only one part of a wider ecosystem of policies and measures in favor of a strong and vibrant construction and renovation market. And to mainstream all those successful financing schemes and scale them up all over Europe, we need qualified people to understand those schemes, to run them. We need qualified people on the ground to actually do the works. And I would finish as well, need political willingness, which is key as well. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to discussions.
Thank you very much, Helen, for that comprehensive overview of financing for energy efficiency and for the Renovation Wave, for introducing some creative ideas that we will have to look to going forward in the EU. So I remind you that this is the opportunity for you to type your questions into the chat box, and to do so by asking everybody so we can all see what's going on. And Helen, the first question has come in from Heike Lieberle, the Greens advisor in the European Parliament. Her question is, have you also considered if funds on the crisis could be combined with building renovation?
Thank you, Heike, for the question. So yes, we are following, of course, the developments of all the changes on MFF, but also the plans that the Commission and Member States are coming up. I would say there are two parts. The first one, of course, we need funds being dispersed to get out of the crisis, and this is really short term. And then, of course, medium term, we think that, of course, the recovery measures that Europe and member states will put in place should tackle, of course, building renovation. This is a good long-term solution to a lot of issues, being health at home, bringing back jobs to local to the local economies, and also in terms of the communities. It's also an interesting idea. Then on the concrete proposal, we've heard that the Commission intends to come up with a new proposal or adjustments to the multi-annual financial framework. We don't know yet what it will really look like. So yeah, at the moment, I think we have to first get out of the crisis, and then we will work, of course, on the recovery plan. But for sure, the Green Deal should be the response to the economic downturn.
Thank you for that, Helen. I'm going to link two questions because I see two questions on the ETS revenues. The first one from Iona Biscata. How many member states are directing their ETS revenues towards building renovation? And there's a question from Shay Kavanagh, which reads, how come some countries prefer fee and dividend for carbon rather than targeting the carbon tax funds towards energy efficiency measures, especially in fuel-poor housing? I guess the second question is, what's your view on why countries aren't motivated to use their carbon revenues in the way we are promoting?
Mm-hmm. So the first question, I know of 3 member states that are actually using ETS revenues for energy efficiency in buildings, and that is, as I mentioned, Czechia, which has a specific program. And I also know about France and Germany. France, I think, is using ETS revenues for specifically energy renovation targeted at vulnerable households with the in French, it's called ANA, so it's the Agence Nationale pour l'Habitat, so it's really targeted at some specific households. In Germany, I don't know the specifics, so those are the 3 member states I know of. Maybe there are more, but I don't know of more. And then the second question, why is it that some member states are actually using it and some others they don't? Well, it's because there isn't actually a legal requirement to do so. And this actually could be a good way forward, is to say the ETS revenues, we think actually the ETS is about saving carbon. And of course, then all the revenues should be affected to saving carbon. At the moment, there is no clear requirement, or at least the member states in the way they're reporting how they use their ETS revenues. They're not clearly showing how actually they use those revenues. And sometimes they're also calculating, for example, an amount that comes from ETS revenues, and then they claim any program on environmental protection or climate programs to come from those revenues, while it is not the case. It's just kind of an accounting trick. So I think it's a matter of also legal clarity and also something a bit more binding that would help member states to actually direct more of their revenues to energy efficiency measures. And of course, sharing best practices would help, I think, in that matter.
Thank you, Helen, for that. Another question on a different topic from Dominic. So are you suggesting to link the EU taxonomy to the energy refurbishment of buildings? He says, then that would surely be a lot of fun in terms of paperwork. Are you thinking about a threshold here? I don't know if you can tackle that.
Yeah, so actually I mentioned the taxonomy actually more in the enabling framework or enabling conditions, saying that actually this is an initiative that is proposed by the Commission and is worked on actually with member states and parliament to give more clarity to financial institutions. I think it's more to help them directing their investments towards something that is clearly sustainable, and as they say, it's to avoid greenwashing. It's to give them a bit more guidance and clarity about what is sustainable and what is not. And I mentioned it in the slide about enabling conditions, because in the taxonomy you have parts on new buildings, on energy renovation of buildings, on renovation of elements, and on acquisition of buildings. and you have some information that is given there to financial institutions on at which point can you consider that investing in a new building or investing in a renovation can be considered as sustainable. Then the suggestion to link it directly to the refurbishment, I don't think that my intention was not to say that refurbishment should use the taxonomy as kind of a methodology or a certification. That is not what I meant to say. So it's not in terms of paperwork that wouldn't change anything. And in terms of threshold, the question about the threshold, I think there is in the taxonomy a threshold which is for renovation and improvement of 30%. Well, we know, and it's widely accepted, that deep renovation is actually at least 60%. This is kind of the definition widely agreed. So I think the taxonomy is a first good step for financial institutions to help them identifying sustainable practices. Yeah, but it needs improvement, and it will have some improvements over time.
Thank you again, Helen. So moving on, I see two questions from Peter Sweetman. The first one, and maybe there might be a link between the two. The first one says, given the European Commission's finding that most renovations are self-funded, clearly the people taking the renovation decision need to know how to access all these instruments. In your opinion, are the instruments oriented to provide building owners easy access? And his second question is, with respect of COVID recovery funds, governments are targeting individuals via tax authorities to pay them when they are furloughed off work in this period. Are these emergency channels usable to distribute money for renovation? So I say there's a link because they both refer to usually individuals or own funds. Helen.
Yes, so the first question about most renovation being actually self-funded, I have read, I mean, that's from the Commission study, that in the survey they've done, the reason behind, I think, is because people are not willing to take loans. So that's why they actually went for, own resources when taking the decision to renovate. But I mean, I think that question needs further investigation, because the study from the Commission is the first step, but of course it would need further investigation. And then the question about the instruments, are they oriented to provide building owners an easy access? I think that's the main point, that we clearly need to have financing tools. All these funds which are available are coming from the EU, then to the national level, and then they need someone to make the link between where the money sits and the building owners. And we've seen that, for example, with EIB funds. The EIB is clearly interested in financing a lot of projects in building renovation, but they say that they're demand driven and that it should come from the market. And building owners, they don't have the capacity to, I mean, to on their own build those projects and bundle together. So I think there is a missing actor, and that's why I've called it, I mean, it could be advisory services, or one-stop shops. I mean, they can have different names, but there is clearly a missing actor in the chain to bring the funds from where it sits to building owners, and that would facilitate access, I think, and therefore they would not rely on their own funds. And then the question to COVID recovery funds, and if those could be distributed for renovation. I have seen, so the first recovery measures which were agreed, those, I think it's 37 billion euro, actually coming from unspent, unused cohesion funds. So European Regional Development Fund and Cohesion Funds not used in 2020, so from this current period, which are actually sitting in the member states' pocket already, and they can be, I think, directed towards employment scheme, helping SMEs to recover, paying actually people when they've lost their salaries, and also in the health sector specifically for basically buying materials. So that's the latest information I have, which was agreed. I think it was a proposal from the Commission mid-March, and then it was agreed by member states and Parliament. So I think it's quite restricted in that sense. The first, let's say, short-term, quick recovery measures just agreed.
Okay, Helen. I think I'm going to take 2 more questions because we're coming close to the end, and then further questions we'll get back to the participants separately. And the first of them is from Céline Carré. You mentioned that financing is not less, but not more relevant than other barriers. Could you elaborate a bit more? And in connection with that question, Julia Barbano asks whether or not which is the EC report on those barriers and incentives. So we will answer that question separately, Julia, after the seminar. So just on elaborating a bit more, and then we'll turn to the final question, which comes from the European Commission. Thanks, Helen.
Yes. So to the question on financing being not less but not more relevant than other barriers, this is actually coming from indeed the Commission study published last year on renovation rates and uptake of nearly zero energy buildings. And yes, it is actually the link that is shared in the chat box. So actually the Commission undertook a study where they did a survey of building owners who did some renovation works, but also engineers and architects, I mean, people working on the ground. And they have highlighted different incentives, so different motivations to renovate, which are at play. And which is interesting is that motivations, incentives are somehow different according to different people. And then they also looked at different so-called barriers or what is hindering deep renovations. And when they say it's not less but also not more relevant than other barriers, is that when you look at how people responded to the survey, there wasn't a barrier that actually, or a motivation that it was actually more important than the other. And I would say that actually access to tailored advice was maybe a bit more important than others. So I don't know if it makes sense, but I really yes advise everyone to look at this study to have all the explanation.
Thank you. And with thanks for everyone who's asked questions, I'll just come to the last question from Andras Toth at the European Commission DG Klima. He says, renovation needs to be also climate resilient. Have you considered involving insurance companies through resilience contracting, similar to energy performance contracting? Insurance companies financing climate resilient renovation and then delaying the lowering of risk premiums to recover the costs. It's a new idea, Helen. What do you think?
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting. So first, I think indeed that mentioning renovation being needing to be also climate resilient is I think something in where we are looking into, and that the link between energy and other parts are becoming more and more important. And then considering the involvement of insurance companies, this is not something we've been looking into in the past month or years. So am not, yeah, I don't know if this is actually existing, or I haven't actually heard of any project or member states doing it. But that is of course interesting if, yes, more, how to say, more approaches are brought into this aspect. As I was hinting in my slides, that there are so many building types and also characteristics of different households. We need, it might look complex, but we need different approaches and different financing programs and schemes to be really adapted to either an area or a segment. This is something new I haven't heard about, but it could be interesting to bring into this new approach and new perspective into renovation, yes.
So once again, Helen, thank you very much for the expose and the answers to the questions. It is now my duty to hand over again to our president, who will draw some conclusions from today's webinar. Over to you, Julie.
Yes, thank you, Adrian. And I'm left with -1 minute for the conclusions, and that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned, because that means we had a really good debate on this call. But I mean, I think in the conclusion, to start off, first of all, there is no more cost-effective way to meeting our 2050 targets than to focus on energy efficiency, and we need to start with potential as biggest, and that means the building stock. We will have huge investment needs in years to come. Elaine talked about an additional 260 billion euros per year between 2021 and 2030 to reach the current 2030 targets, right? And I think what a lot of the questions and the comments have circled around is this missing link of how do we channel the right money to the right people, and also bearing in mind that a substantial part of the financing needs will be around the residential building stock. How do we tackle these smaller projects? What sort of approach do we need going forward? And Elaine called it like a missing actor. This sort of link between the advisory services, so a one-stop shop, a renovation passport, work coordinators, whatever you want to say, and then the financing. Then I think just from the comments, we answered some of the questions, and I'd like to pick up just a couple more. This notion, of course, of crisis we're in, and could that be combined to doing something on building renovation? Well, yes, absolutely. We will see huge funds being set up now at European and national level, and it's very, very important that we make sure that we capture the green transition and building renovation as part of that. And then I think the point as well about the ETS revenues, the fact that only 3 member states are currently using those for energy efficiency, and this sort of discussion about do we maybe need to do something about that on a more legislative level to force those funds into a more useful purpose from an energy efficiency point. And then finally, there were a couple of comments and questions about sort of the EU versus national versus regional focus. And of course, the webinar today was to provide an overview of what's happening at EU level. But as Hélène pointed out in the beginning of the presentation, we do work with partners as well through Renovate Europe. And so working with national schemes and working with regional schemes is, as far as we're concerned, a very important part of the overall sort of puzzle to finance energy efficiency in buildings across Europe. And I think one of the real beauties of this sort of webinar format that we were forced into because of Corona is that it allows us a much broader participation, not just from the usual suspects in Brussels, but also across member states. And we really want to make the most of that opportunity to have you all on board and share all your experiences. So thank you very much for staying with us throughout these 45 minutes. And we hope to see you online again on Friday for the next workshop. And with that, back to Adrian.
Thank you, Julie. And only to say thank you again for attending, and looking forward to seeing you all online again on Friday. Have a good week. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.